As you might have noticed, the German economy is in a bit of a rut at the moment. Once the engine of Europe, German growth has now lagged behind the rest of the Eurozone for a few years now, thanks to marked declines in exports and industrial production. However, a couple of months ago, it looked like the economy might finally be back on track. And in June, two of Germany's largest research institutes dramatically upgraded their growth forecasts for 2025 and 2026. However, that optimism has since evaporated. Late last month, the German Statistics Agency announced that the German economy shrank by 0.3% in the second quarter, and actually revised down its overall GDP figures for 2023 and 2024, implying, somewhat astonishingly, that the German economy is still smaller than it was in 2019. This speaks to an oft-overlooked fact about Germany's economic crisis. People often assume it started with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent disruption to energy supplies, but German growth rates were actually falling behind the rest of the Eurozone as early as 2019. So anyway, in this video, we thought we'd take yet another look at Germany's economic crisis and why it still hasn't gotten any better. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, as we see it, the structural problem facing the German economy is that its export-oriented industrial model no longer looks viable. For context, Germany's economy has long relied on exports, especially in industrial goods like cars, to fuel its growth. This used to work well. The German economy grew steadily from the mid-2000s until the late 2010s, thanks to exports to countries like China and America. Strong exports also meant that Germany ran persistent trade surpluses. In other words, exported more than it imported, averaging about 7% of GDP. Most other Western economies ran slight deficits of about 1 or 2% of GDP, and even countries like Japan and China, who are often singled out for their unbalanced trade practices, ran far smaller surpluses. This all helped Germany outgrow its peers and avoid the sort of severe deindustrialization that occurred in other developed economies. For context, manufacturing still accounts for nearly 20% of German GDP, compared to more like 10% in the US, France, and the UK. This made the German economy the envy of Europe, and books like this one became bestsellers in the UK. Successive German governments, beginning with Gerhard Schröder in the 90s and 2000s, bought into this project. This was most apparent in the car industry, which has long been seen as the cornerstone of Germany's export-oriented industrial model, and enjoyed preferential policy treatment. Schröder himself was literally nicknamed the Autokanzler, and the previous government was sometimes criticised for its coziness with the car industry. However, popular as it might have been both inside and outside of Germany, both the export bit and the industry bit of this model were always vulnerable. For starters, this reliance on exports made the German economy more vulnerable to slowdowns in the global economy, because if other countries' economies stalled, this would mean less international demand for German exports. Nor was Germany's domestic economy in any position to pick up the slack, thanks to chronically weak domestic demand. For context, while Germany's politicians often touted trade surpluses as proof of Germany's industrial brilliance, they were just as much a reflection of Germany's domestic weakness. After all, a trade surplus just means you're selling more stuff than you're buying. Furthermore, while there's clearly something to be said for protecting your manufacturing sector, and many developed economies are now trying to use quote-unquote industrial policy to bring their manufacturing share of GDP back up to German levels, traditional industry are more vulnerable to international competition than more advanced industries or services. If you live in Germany, for instance, it's easier to replace your German-made car with a Chinese-made car than it is to, say, replace your German lawyer with a Chinese one. This has been exacerbated by Germany's stubborn refusal to move out of traditional heavy industries like cars and, say, into newer industries like AI, which were always more at risk from foreign competition. Anyway, the limit of this model first became apparent in early 2019, when the German economy slowed and actually contracted in the second quarter, largely as a consequence of a steep decline in industrial production, which fell by 4% year-on-year. Quite a lot of this had to do with China. While exports to China had provided a steady source of growth for German industry over the preceding decade or so, as Chinese companies moved up the value chain, they essentially replaced German products inside China. Again, cars are a good example. It was at about this time that Chinese car companies started replacing German cars inside China, as they would later in international markets. German industry was then hit by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent disruption to energy supplies, which pushed up energy prices and made German industry less competitive, and then Trump's return to office earlier this year. Trump's tariffs have obviously had a direct effect on German exports to the US, but they've also triggered a more general slowdown in the world economy, which has been bad news for German exporters and exacerbated an ongoing slump in German industrial production. Nonetheless, there was some hope earlier this year that the German economy might be over the worst of it. Trump's trade wars have settled down, the EU had apparently negotiated a deal, and Friedrich Merz's government announced it would be reforming the so-called debt brake to enable a dramatic increase in public spending that would, in theory, stimulate the domestic economy, potentially providing German industry with a new source of demand. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened. The German economy contracted in the second quarter, and in July, exports fell by 0.6% month-on-month, with exports to the US falling to a 4-year low. So, what's going on here? Well, some of this has to do with Germany's relatively strong wage growth, and the recent strengthening of the euro, which have made German exports less competitive. Germany's fiscal policies have also disappointed. The new government isn't splashing as much cash as expected, and has shied away from more ambitious structural reforms. But the main reason for this renewed decline seems to be China. Chinese companies are beginning to outcompete their German counterparts in international markets, a trend that's been exacerbated by Trump's tariffs, because Chinese exporters have reacted to the disruption to US-China trade by essentially redirecting their exports to Europe and other markets. This meant German companies have had to compete with a flood of Chinese exports, often at cutthroat prices. Unfortunately for Merz & Co., there doesn't seem to be an obvious way out of this crisis. Chinese competition is here to stay, and the rise of protectionism worldwide presents a structural headwind for export-led economies. Perhaps the best way out of this would be to reduce the economy's reliance on exports by stimulating domestic demand while moving out of traditional industries. But this is a long-term project and would require Germany's political class to abandon a growth model they've stuck with for 20 years. It's no secret that problem solving is always found at the heart of politics, whether that's through making important decisions or just understanding how the world works. Here at TLDR, we want to stay on top of our problem solving too, so that's why we use Brilliant. Brilliant is an incredibly comprehensive online learning platform that helps you become a better thinker and problem solver, designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming, and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying, as Brilliant gets you stuck in at the perfect level, allowing you to first start with mastering the foundations, then helps you level up to increasingly challenging problems. Take their fantastic data courses, for example. Whether you're starting fresh or continuing your learning journey, Brilliant offers everything from basics, like data visualizations, to advanced topics like algorithms and regression models. Using real-world data from Airbnb, Spotify, Starbucks, and more, you'll learn to see trends, parse and visualize massive datasets, and make better informed decisions. To start tackling those problems and try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. By doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.